The Situation Room hummed with the controlled chaos of imminent war. Secure video feeds lined the walls, live shots from Kuwait staging areas, aircraft carrier decks in the Persian Gulf, and forward operating bases scattered across the Arabian Peninsula. President George W. Bush sat at the head of the mahogany table, flanked by Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. On the screens, generals appeared in pixelated rectangles. Tommy Franks from Qatar, David McKiernan from Kuwait, and a dozen other commanders whose units recoiled like springs along Iraq's southern border. The briefing had lasted 40 minutes. Intelligence assessments, troop dispositions, air campaign sequencing, chemical weapon contingencies. Bush had listened with the focus of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to unleash, but also with the impatience of someone who'd made his decision weeks ago. The diplomatic path had dead-ended at the United Nations. The weapons inspectors had been withdrawn. Congress had authorized force. The machinery of invasion was already in motion. It only needed the final push. "Mr. President," Frank said from the screen, his Texas drawl cutting through the encrypted feed, "we're ready to execute. CENTCOM has coordinated with all component commanders. Air assets are positioned. Ground forces are staged. We can begin the air campaign within 6 hours of your order, ground operations within 48. Bush leaned forward, elbows on the table. His eyes scanned the faces on the screens, men who would send other men into combat, who would bear the operational burden of a decision made in this wood-paneled room thousands of miles from the desert. He thought about his father's Gulf War, the 100-hour ground campaign that had become legend. He thought about Afghanistan, where the Taliban had fallen in weeks, but bin Laden had slipped away. He thought about the intelligence reports claiming Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction, the debate that had fractured the international community, and the political capital he'd spent to reach this moment. "General Franks," Bush said, his voice carrying the clipped certainty that characterized his public speeches, "I'm not interested in a repeat of 91. I don't want a slow roll. I don't want Saddam to have time to regroup, to relocate his weapons, to disappear into some hole where we'll be hunting him for years. We go in hard, we go in fast, and we decapitate the regime before they know what hit them." Rumsfeld interjected, his sharp features animated with the aggressive confidence that had defined his tenure. "Shock and awe, Mr. President. That's the concept. Overwhelming force applied with such speed and precision that resistance collapses psychologically before it can organize militarily. We hit command and control nodes, communications infrastructure, Republican Guard positions, all simultaneously. We create paralysis." Bush nodded, but his attention remained locked on Franks. "Tommy, how fast can you get to Baghdad?" Franks paused, calculating not just logistics but political implications. "Mr. President, if everything goes according to plan, and it never does, our lead elements could be on the outskirts of the capital within a week. Full seizure of the city, maybe 2 weeks, depending on resistance levels." "Make it faster," Bush said. The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. "I want Saddam's regime gone before the Arab Street can mobilize, before the Russians or French can push another Security Council resolution, before CNN turns this into a quagmire narrative. Make it fast, Tommy. Make it so fast they can't believe what happened." Frank's face on the screen remained professionally neutral, but those who knew him well could see the micro-expression, a brief tightening around the eyes that indicated he was already running through contingencies, recalculating timelines, measuring the gap between presidential directive and battlefield reality. "Understood, Mr. President. We'll execute with maximum speed." The meeting concluded with technical details. H-hour timing, rules of engagement communication protocols. But the essential guidance had been delivered in 3 words: make it fast. As the video feeds disconnected and the room began to empty, Rice approached Bush with a folder containing the final legal authorizations requiring his signature. "You're certain about this?" she asked quietly, a question that carried the weight of their long relationship, dating back to his father's administration. Bush signed the documents without hesitation. Saddam had 12 years to comply. 12 years to prove he'd disarmed. He chose defiance. Now he gets regime change. What neither of them fully grasped in that moment was how literally the military would interpret "make it fast," how the coming invasion would unfold with a velocity that would shock not just Saddam's regime, but the American planners themselves. The expectation was weeks. The reality would be measured in hours. Across the Atlantic, in a nondescript MI6 station outside London, intelligence officer Martin Crowther was reviewing intercepts from Baghdad when his American counterpart forwarded him a flash message. POTUS has given execute order. H-hour in 48 hours. Prepare all human assets for exfiltration or activation. Crowther had spent 3 years cultivating sources inside Iraq's military structure, mid-level officers disaffected with Saddam's paranoid purges, bureaucrats who saw the writing on the wall, even a cousin of a Republican Guard commander who'd been feeding information about troop morale and equipment readiness. The intelligence picture they'd assembled was sobering. Iraq's military was a hollow force, riddled with corruption, demoralized by years of sanctions, equipped with Soviet-era hardware that barely functioned. But hollow forces could still kill. Crowther had seen enough wars to know that desperate men with nothing to lose could inflict casualties far beyond their paper strength. He drafted a cable to his field agents. Invasion imminent. Activate all compromise protocols. Priority intelligence. Locations of chemical weapons. Saddam's whereabouts. Republican Guard command structure. The responses that trickled back over the next day painted a picture of a regime in denial. Saddam's inner circle believed the Americans were bluffing, that the UN would intervene, that Arab nations would rise in solidarity. They were planning a defense of Baghdad predicated on urban warfare, Mogadishu-style chaos that would bog down American armor and turn international opinion against the invasion. They had distributed weapons to Ba'ath Party loyalists, positioned Fedayeen Saddam paramilitaries throughout the capital, and prepared to fight from mosques, hospitals, and schools. What they hadn't prepared for was speed. Their entire defensive concept assumed a methodical American advance, the kind of telegraphed assault that would give them time to reposition, to rally, to turn the invasion into a bloody spectacle. Crowther forwarded his analysis to CENTCOM with a single recommendation. Do not give them time to organize. Strike faster than they can respond. The intelligence community had spent months debating Iraq's capabilities. The consensus was that Saddam retained chemical weapons, degraded, perhaps, but viable, that he had mobile biological weapons labs, that his nuclear program, though disrupted, retained reconstitution potential. These assessments, later proven catastrophically wrong, drove the urgency in Washington. The fear wasn't just Saddam's threat to his neighbors, but what would happen if those weapons fell into terrorist hands after his regime collapsed chaotically? So the order, make it fast, carried layered meanings. Fast enough to prevent weapons dispersal. Fast enough to minimize casualties. Fast enough to forestall international opposition. Fast enough to psychologically shatter resistance before it could coalesce into an insurgency. In Kuwait, where the 3rd Infantry Division staged in a sprawling tent city, soldiers received the alert with a mixture of readiness and apprehension. They'd trained for months in the desert, rehearsing battle drills, zeroing weapons, and studying maps of Iraqi cities with names they couldn't pronounce. Now the waiting was over. Sergeants moved through the ranks distributing ammunition, final intelligence updates, and letters to be delivered home if they didn't return. Captain Brad Whitman, a company commander in the division's lead brigade, gathered his platoon leaders for a final brief. The word from division is simple. We're going fast and we're going deep. No pause, no consolidation. We punch through their border defenses, bypass resistance, and drive straight for Baghdad. They're expecting Desert Storm. Slow, methodical, overwhelming firepower. We're giving them something they've never seen. One of his lieutenants, fresh from West Point, asked the obvious question. Sir, what if we outrun our supply lines? What if they counterattack our flanks? Whitman had asked himself the same questions. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. A mechanized thrust covering hundreds of miles through hostile territory, depending on speed and surprise rather than methodical consolidation. It violated doctrine, risked encirclement, and assumed Iraqi forces would collapse rather than rally. Then we adapt, Whitman said, with more confidence than he felt. But the intel says their command structure is brittle. We hit them hard enough, fast enough, they won't have time to coordinate a response. That's the bet we're making. As night fell over the Kuwaiti desert, the invasion force made final preparations. Apache helicopters armed with Hellfire missiles, Abrams tanks with thermal optics capable of fighting in total darkness, Bradley fighting vehicles carrying infantry trained for both mechanized warfare and urban combat, and overhead, a constellation of aircraft, B-2 stealth bombers, F-117 Nighthawks, cruise missiles aboard warships, ready to unleash the shock and awe that Rumsfeld had promised. The order had been given. The clock was ticking. In less than 36 hours, the world would witness whether make it fast was strategic brilliance or fatal hubris. The first missile struck Baghdad at 5:34 a.m. local time, just as the city was beginning to stir with the dawn call to prayer. Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from warships in the Persian Gulf, screamed to the pre-dawn darkness at 550 miles per hour, guided by GPS coordinates programmed weeks earlier. Their targets: the Presidential Palace Complex, the Ministry of Defense, Ba'ath Party headquarters, intelligence service buildings, and communications nodes scattered throughout the capital. Lieutenant Colonel Hassan al-Takriti was in his office at Republican Guard headquarters when the building 3 blocks away exploded in a fireball that shattered his windows and sent him diving under his desk. The concussion wave rattled his bones. Alarm shrieked. Men shouted in confusion and panic. He crawled to the window and saw a mushroom cloud rising over what had been the Central Communications Facility, the node that connected Republican Guard divisions to Baghdad Command. His phone was dead. The computer network was dark. He ran into the hallway where other officers stood frozen, watching smoke billow across the city skyline. More explosions followed in rapid succession. Precision strikes that spoke to intelligence far beyond what al-Takriti had believed possible. They knew exactly where to hit. They'd mapped every critical node in Iraq's military infrastructure and were now systematically destroying them. "Get to your units," al-Takriti shouted at the stunned officers. "If we can't command from here, commanders need to act independently." But that was the problem Rumsfeld's planners had identified. Iraqi forces were built on a Soviet model that emphasized centralized control. Cut off the head, and the body would thrash uselessly. Al-Takriti knew this as well as the Americans. He'd studied at Soviet military academies, had participated in the Iran-Iraq war where rigid command structures had cost him dearly. But knowing the vulnerability and fixing it were different things. Saddam's paranoia meant he'd never allowed the decentralized leadership necessary for resilient military operations. Every major decision had to flow through Baghdad, through him, and now Baghdad was burning. At CENTCOM's forward headquarters in Qatar, General Tommy Franks watched real-time footage from Predator drones circling over Iraq. The initial strikes had achieved complete surprise. Iraqi air defenses had fired blindly into the sky, but the stealthy aircraft delivering the opening salvos were already gone, replaced by wave after wave of conventional fighters and bombers now that air superiority had been established. "Ground forces?" Franks asked. "Crossing the border now, sir," replied his operations officer, Colonel Mark Peterson. "Third ID is through the breach. Marines are pushing north from Kuwait. UK forces are securing Basra approaches. No significant resistance at the border." This was the crucial moment, the transition from air campaign to ground invasion. The plan called for mechanized columns to drive deep into Iraq before defensive positions could be reinforced, before commanders could coordinate responses, before the psychological shock of the air assault wore off. Speed was both tactic and strategy. On the ground, Captain Whitman's company crossed into Iraq as part of a massive armored column stretching for miles. They'd rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but nothing quite prepared you for the reality. The dust kicked up by hundreds of vehicles, the radio chatter reporting contact or lack thereof, the tension of not knowing whether the next kilometer would bring ambush or surrender. The border defenses, trenches, bunkers, minefields, had been pounded by artillery and air strikes. What resistance remained was token. Iraqi soldiers, many of them conscripts who'd been pressed into service, emerged from positions waving white flags or simply fled into the desert. Whitman's rules of engagement were clear. Accept surrenders, but don't slow down. Bypass fortified positions, and let follow-on forces deal with them. "This is too easy," his gunner muttered over the intercom as they rolled past an abandoned Iraqi bunker, its occupants long gone. Whitman shared the unease. Military plans always assumed worst-case scenarios, but this was approaching best case: minimal resistance, rapid advance, enemy forces dissolving before contact. It felt wrong, like walking into a trap, but the intelligence had predicted this. Iraqi morale was brittle. Units were undermanned and undersupplied. Officers were corrupt and incompetent. Still, easy victories made soldiers nervous. It was the hard fights that felt predictable. In Baghdad, Al-Takriti finally reached his division commander by radio, a cumbersome backup system that required relay through field stations. The news was catastrophic. American forces had penetrated over 50 kilometers into Iraqi territory in the first 6 hours, not just in one sector, but across the entire southern front. Divisions that were supposed to be manning defensive positions were reporting that they'd been bypassed, encircled, or had lost contact with their subordinate units. Where they headed? Al-Takriti demanded. "Everywhere," the commander replied, his voice cracking with stress. Nazariya and Najaf outcut, but the main axis is clearly Baghdad. They're not stopping to secure ground. They're just driving north. Al-Takriti understood the tactical logic, even as it terrified him. The Americans were racing toward Baghdad before the regime could establish a coherent defense. If they maintained this pace, they could reach the capital within days, not weeks. The entire defensive strategy, predicated on grinding urban warfare, would be mooted if there was no time to prepare the city for siege. He tried to reach the presidential palace to report the situation, but all lines to Saddam's compound were down. The leadership was either dead, in hiding, or as cut off as he was. This was the nightmare scenario Soviet doctrine had warned about: catastrophic decapitation, where the loss of command and control cascaded into systemic collapse. By nightfall on the first day, American forces had advanced over 150 kilometers into Iraq. News networks broadcast footage of burning oil wells, set ablaze by Iraqi forces in a futile attempt to obscure air reconnaissance, and surrendering soldiers. But they also showed something unexpected: the speed of the advance. Embedded journalists with the 3rd Infantry Division transmitted reports describing a rolling thunder of armor moving faster than anyone had predicted. At the White House, Bush watched the coverage with satisfaction that bordered on vindication. His order, "make it fast," was being executed beyond expectation. Rumsfeld, never one for understatement, described it as the most rapid and precise military operation in modern history. But in the Pentagon's war room, more cautious voices expressed concern. The advance had outpaced logistics. Supply convoys struggled to keep up with the forward units. The flanks were exposed. Iraqi units that had been bypassed could theoretically regroup and attack the vulnerable supply lines. And most troubling, there were still no signs of the chemical weapons that had justified the invasion. "We're racing toward Baghdad, but we don't have a complete picture of what we're racing into," warned one intelligence analyst during a video brief. Saddam could be preparing a last stand in the city. Chemical weapons could be deployed. We could be walking into a Stalingrad scenario. Franks dismissed the concerns publicly, but privately he increased the tempo even further. The only way to prevent a Stalingrad was to arrive before Saddam could organize one. Speed was the answer to every contingency. Speed prevented the enemy from adapting, from rallying, from deploying weapons of mass destruction if they indeed possessed them. The invasion had become a race between American velocity and Iraqi cohesion. And in the first 24 hours, it was clear which side was winning. 36 hours into the invasion, the facade of Iraqi military resistance had not merely cracked. It had shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. What the American commanders were witnessing went beyond their most optimistic projections. This wasn't just rapid victory. It was systemic implosion, the complete disintegration of a military apparatus that, on paper, had been the 4th largest army in the world. Captain Whitman's company had covered nearly 300 kilometers since crossing the border. They'd encountered scattered firefights, pockets of fleeing Saddam paramilitaries who fought with the desperate ferocity of true believers, and irregular forces that appeared from nowhere to ambush supply convoys before melting back into the civilian population. But the Iraqi army proper, the Republican Guard divisions that were supposed to be Saddam's elite shield, had simply evaporated. Sir, we're getting reports from UAV feeds, Whitman's radio operator called out. Massive vehicle columns abandoning positions south of Baghdad. They're not retreating in formation. They're just running. Soldiers ditching uniforms, equipment, everything. Whitman peered through his optics at the highway ahead. Abandoned Iraqi military vehicles littered the roadside. T-72 tanks, with their crews gone. BMP infantry fighting vehicles left idling with hatches open. Artillery pieces unhitched from their towing trucks. Some had been destroyed by airstrikes, but most were simply vacant ghost equipment from a ghost army. The psychological warfare campaign had worked beyond anyone's expectations. In the weeks before invasion, CIA and military intelligence had dropped millions of leaflets, broadcast radio messages, and sent text messages to Iraqi officers with a simple proposition: abandon your positions, go home to your families, and you will not be harmed. Resist, and you will be destroyed from the air before you even see American forces. For many Iraqi officers, especially those in regular army units, it was an easy calculation. They'd survived the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War, 13 years of sanctions and internal purges. They had no love for Saddam, no willingness to die for a regime that had brought them nothing but hardship. When the invasion came with a speed and violence that shattered any illusion of successful resistance, they made the rational choice: survival over loyalty. Lieutenant Colonel Al-Takriti watched this collapse from his headquarters bunker with a mixture of rage and despair. He'd tried to reach his division's subordinate units throughout the night, issuing orders to establish defensive positions, to coordinate with adjacent units, to prepare for the American advance. But each hour brought new reports of units disintegrating, of commanders abandoning their posts, of entire battalions surrendering without a fight or simply dissolving into the civilian population. The 51st Division reports they have less than 30% of their combat strength. His operations officer reported, his voice hollow with exhaustion. The 18th Brigade cannot be reached. We believe the entire unit has deserted. The 3rd Republican Guard Division is falling back to Baghdad in disorder. They're not conducting a fighting withdrawal. They're fleeing. Al-Takriti slammed his fist on the map table. Where's the leadership? Where are the orders from Baghdad? No one had an answer. The command structure that was supposed to orchestrate Iraq's defense had ceased to function. Phone networks were destroyed. Radio communications were jammed or intercepted. Runners sent between units were captured or lost. The presidential palace was dark and silent, either evacuated or too afraid to broadcast orders that might be used to target leadership locations. This was the nightmare that Soviet advisors had warned about decades ago, a centralized military system's catastrophic failure, when its command nodes were eliminated. Without direction from above, Iraqi units were paralyzed, incapable of independent action, trained to await orders that would never come. At CENTCOM, the intelligence updates were arriving faster than analysts could process them. Satellite imagery showed Iraqi military installations abandoned, highways clogged with soldiers walking away from the fight, command centers going dark. Intercepted communications revealed panic, confusion, and officers ordering retreats without authorization. We're not looking at a fighting withdrawal, one analyst briefed Franks. We're witnessing organizational collapse. The Iraqi military is ceasing to exist as a coherent force. Franks absorbed this with the wariness of a commander who'd seen plans go sideways too many times to trust early success. What about the Special Republican Guard? What about Saddam's personal security units? Those are true believers. They won't just fold. No, sir, they're still intact around Baghdad, but they're isolated. The regular army was supposed to be their shield, absorbing the initial American assault and buying time for a defense of the capital. That shield is gone. Now they're alone, facing the full weight of our forces with no depth, no reserves, no strategic space. The plan had always been to reach Baghdad quickly, but this was beyond quick. This was unprecedented. Military historians would later compare it to the German blitzkrieg through France in 1940, or the Israeli Six-Day War in 1967, but those campaigns had taken weeks. This was measuring in hours. Bush received the update during his daily intelligence briefing, delivered by CIA Director George Tenet. Mr. President, the Iraqi military is in a state of collapse. Our ground forces are encountering minimal resistance. We estimate they'll reach Baghdad's outskirts within 48 hours. Chemical weapons? Bush asked, the question that had dominated his thinking since authorizing the invasion. No deployments, no detections, no indicators. Either they don't have them in a usable state, or they've decided not to use them. We're continuing to search, but so far, nothing. Bush nodded. But the absence of WMDs was a problem for later. Right now, the objective was regime change, and that objective was being achieved at a speed that was almost unsettling. Wars weren't supposed to be this easy. There was supposed to be more friction, more resistance, more cost. But make it fast had been the order, and fast was exactly what was happening. Captain Whitman's company reached the outskirts of Karbala, a city that American planners had identified as a potential choke point, a place where Iraqi forces might make a stand to defend the approaches to Baghdad. Intelligence had warned of chemical weapons possibly positioned here, of Republican Guard units dug in for urban combat. Instead, they found chaos. Iraqi military vehicles abandoned in the streets, weapons scattered, soldiers in civilian clothes try to blend into the population. A few firefights erupted, Fedayeen fighters firing from buildings before being quickly suppressed, but nothing like the sustained resistance that had been anticipated. This doesn't make sense, Whitman muttered to his executive officer as they established a position on the city's edge. Where's the fight? Where's the defense of Baghdad? We were brief about. Maybe we broke them, the XO replied. Maybe they looked at what happened to their units in the south and decided it wasn't worth dying for Saddam. It was the most logical explanation, but it left Whitman with an uncomfortable feeling. Victories were supposed to be hard-won, paid for in blood and sacrifice. This felt more like a rout, like they'd punched through a paper tiger. It diminished the accomplishment, made him wonder what they were really fighting for if the enemy had never really been there. In his bunker, Al-Takriti received a call on his personal cell phone, a dangerous breach of communication security. But the formal military networks were all but dead. It was his brother, calling from Baghdad. Hassan, you need to leave. The regime is finished. Saddam's sons have fled. The ministries are being abandoned. People are looting government buildings. The Americans will be here tomorrow, maybe tonight. If you stay with the military, you'll be killed or captured. Al-Takriti thought about the oath he'd taken, the years of service, the friends who died in previous wars. Then he thought about his wife and children, about what would happen to them if he became a martyr for a lost cause. I'll think about it, he said, and ended the call. He looked around the bunker. Officers staring at maps that no longer reflected reality, radios crackling with desperate calls from units that couldn't be helped, a command staff trying to fight a war with an army that no longer existed. The collapse was complete, not because the Americans had won every battle, but because there had barely been battles to win. The Iraqi military had disintegrated under the psychological weight of an enemy that moved too fast, hit too hard, and knew too much. Speed had been the ultimate weapon, more effective than bombs or bullets. It had shattered the will to resist before resistance could be organized. Al-Takriti made his decision. He removed his Republican Guard insignia, changed into civilian clothes stored in his locker, and walked out of the bunker into a city that was already preparing for occupation. The war, at least in its conventional phase, was over. What came next would be something else entirely, something none of them, American or Iraqi, were truly prepared for. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, the collapse was complete. The presidential palace, Saddam Hussein's monument to power and paranoia, stood empty as the first American tanks rolled into Baghdad's outer neighborhoods. The massive bronze statues of the dictator, erected throughout the city as symbols of his unshakable grip on Iraq, would soon be toppled by jubilant crowds and American Marines, images that would be broadcast worldwide as proof of liberation. But in those first hours, before the choreographed symbolism, there was only the eerie quiet of a regime that had simply ceased to exist. Colonel David Perkins, commanding the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division, led a thunder run into the heart of Baghdad, a bold armored thrust designed to shatter any remaining illusion of Iraqi control. His M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles roared down Saddam's grand boulevards, past government ministries and Ba'ath Party headquarters, engaging scattered resistance, but encountering nothing like the urban warfare nightmare that had been predicted. We expected Stalingrad. Perkins would later tell reporters, "We got a parade route with occasional potholes." The potholes were real. Fedayeen fighters with RPGs, suicide car bombs, snipers firing from rooftops. But they were disorganized, uncoordinated, desperate acts by true believers who hadn't received the memo that the war was over. The Iraqi military, such as it still existed, was in full retreat or had dissolved entirely. Saddam himself had disappeared, his whereabouts unknown, his voice absent from the airwaves that had once broadcast his endless speeches. Captain Whitman's company secured a sector near the Tigris River, establishing checkpoints and beginning the unglamorous work of occupation. His soldiers, who trained for intense combat, found themselves doing police work, searching vehicles, questioning civilians, trying to distinguish between surrendering soldiers, genuine refugees, and potential insurgents. "Sir, what are we supposed to do now?" one of his young privates asked, exhausted from 3 days of continuous operations, but also confused by the sudden transition from invasion to occupation. It was a question Whitman couldn't fully answer, because the planners in Washington hadn't fully answered it either. The entire focus had been on regime change, on the rapid military victory that Bush had ordered. What came after, how to govern a country of 25 million people, how to prevent sectarian violence, how to build a functioning democracy in a society traumatized by decades of dictatorship. Those were problems that had been secondary to the primary objective of make it fast. And they had made it fast. 36 hours from the border to the collapse of organized Iraqi resistance. Perhaps not literal control of every city and town, but the psychological and organizational destruction of the regime's ability to fight back. It was, by any conventional military metric, a stunning success, a vindication of Rumsfeld's transformation doctrine, of Bush's decisiveness, of American military technology and training. But Lieutenant Colonel Altacredi, watching from a safe house where he'd gone aground, saw something different. He saw a military that had been hollow long before the Americans arrived, corroded by corruption, paranoia, and incompetence. The invasion hadn't destroyed the Iraqi army. It had merely revealed what was already dead. Saddam's regime had been a facade, impressive from a distance but rotten at the core. "We lost this war years ago," he told his brother as they watched American helicopters patrol the skies over Baghdad. The Americans just made it official. At the White House, Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office, declaring that major combat operations were effectively complete. The speech was careful, measured, avoiding the triumphalism that his advisors warned might seem premature. But the underlying message was clear. The strategy of speed had worked. The war that experts predicted might take months had been decided in days. "The regime of Saddam Hussein is no more," Bush declared. "The Iraqi people are free to choose their own future, to rebuild their country without fear of torture, repression, or tyranny. This is a historic moment, not just for Iraq, but for the entire Middle East." The cameras captured his confidence, the sense of the president vindicated in his decision to ignore international opposition and move forward with invasion. But they didn't capture complexities already emerging in classified briefings. Reports of looting in Iraqi cities, of power vacuums being filled by militias, of weapons depots being raided, of anger at the destruction and humiliation of occupation, even among Iraqis who'd hated Saddam. General Franks, in his final briefing to the president, laid out the military statistics. Over 300 kilometers advanced in 36 hours, thousands of Iraqi soldiers captured or dispersed, strategic cities secured, casualties minimal compared to predictions. It was the most rapid conventional military victory in modern history, executed with a precision that validated every technological and doctrinal innovation of the past decade. "You gave us the order to make it fast, Mr. President," Franks said. "We made it fast." Bush thanked him, thanked all the commanders and troops who'd executed the plan. But in the quiet moments after the briefing, speaking privately with Rice and Vice President Dick Cheney, he asked a question that would define the next decade. Now what? The what would unfold over years, an insurgency that made a conventional war look like a prologue, sectarian violence that killed hundreds of thousands, political chaos that created space for extremist groups like ISIS, regional instability that metastasized into civil wars in Syria and Yemen. The 36-hour collapse of Saddam's military would be followed by an 8-year American occupation, troop surges, withdrawals, reinterventions. The soldiers who'd executed the lightning invasion would find themselves on multiple deployments, fighting not a conventional army, but an enemy that wore civilian clothes, that planted IEDs instead of manning checkpoints, that melted into the population and struck when guards were down. The clear-cut military victory would give way to a grinding, ambiguous conflict where success was measured not in territory captured, but in reducing violence to acceptable levels, a word that covered a multitude of traumas. Captain Whitman would survive the war, but not the peace. His third deployment would end with an IED strike on his convoy near Fallujah in 2006, injuries that sent him home and nightmares that never left. He would spend years trying to reconcile what he'd experienced in those first 36 hours, the exhilaration of rapid victory. But what came after? The slow, grinding realization that they won a battle and lost something much more complicated. Lieutenant Colonel Al-Takriti would be detained during a sweep operation in 2004, interrogated at Abu Ghraib, released after several months when investigators determined he played no role in insurgency. He would emigrate to Jordan, work as a consultant for Middle Eastern research institutes, and spend the rest of his life trying to explain to Westerners that the speed of the American military victory was precisely what made the subsequent occupation so catastrophic. "You didn't give us time to process what happened," he would say in interviews. "You destroyed the army, the police, the government, all the structures that held society together, in 36 hours. Then you were surprised when society fell apart.